Hi, and welcome to this 10 minutes on Tenant Migration webcast focused on coexistence. My name is Malte Schoch, and I'm a Principal Product Manager at Quest Software. In this short webcast, we are talking about why many companies decide to go with a coexistence or phased migration approach. And we're also talking about the must-have for day one coexistence. And finally, I will share some tips on improving the overall experience with a phased migration. So with every migration, the question is always, can we do a cutover migration or should we plan for coexistence? And I definitely see the benefits of doing cutover migrations, but it depends on how many users and how many workloads your customer is using. Because switching 25 applications and 10,000 users over one weekend is a different story than switching 1,000 users and 5 applications. There is really no question that migrations are getting harder and harder with all the new features and workloads Microsoft is onboarding into Office 365. And the phased migration will buy you time so that you can plan accordingly, but already enable coexistence between the tenants and allow your users to work together. Another benefit of coexistence is that you have a rollback option. Hopefully, you do not need this, but with every migration, there's always something that can go wrong. Maybe you have issues moving a critical application and you need to contact the Microsoft support team. It could be also that you have incorrect identity matching and you cannot fix this quickly. With a phased migration, you have the option to go back to the source, update your plan, and reschedule the event. But when you do a cutover migration, it means at some point you are committed and you can no longer go back to the source. And I think even if you would try to turn around and go back to the source, most likely you will run out of time. It can be also very difficult to support cutover migrations without overloading your support team. You always need to think about what is the worst case scenario and how you want to handle a massive amount of support calls. So you need to create a plan and decide which issues will receive priority. But this also means that in worst case, you will have a situation that some users cannot access what they need for their daily job until you have resources available to focus on this problem. And I think the result of all of this is cutover migrations are risky. It is great if everything goes well, but if you run into issues during the cutover and you stuck, it can be a real nightmare. And that is one of the main reasons why companies decide to do phased migrations. Now let us talk about the solutions for coexistence you should consider for day one. And one of the first solutions you want to implement is a unified GAL. That means that you can find your new colleagues from the other tenant and all of their contact information in one address book. And the next topic should always come together with a unified GAL, and that is free busy sharing. It just makes the scheduling of meetings so much easier if you can see the free busy information for users that are currently not in your tenant. But also think about domain sharing. We still have the limitation today that you cannot share your domain with another tenant. But very often it is a requirement from day one to share your domain with the other tenant and allow the users to send and receive emails under the same domain. And finally, I want to share a few thoughts on how you can improve the overall migration experience with the phased migration. First, planning is always important. It does not matter if you do a cutover or phased migration. And there are different phases of planning required before thinking about what level of coexistence is needed. The first phase is all about discovering apps and identity to understand what you even have in scope for migration. After the first phase, you will go deeper into the applications to understand what you have to deal with. This will include, for example, how many users are working with the application, how is the permission model, or how much data is stored in this application. Because if you discover that, for example, one application is only used by 5% of your users, you may not need to implement a coexistence solution and move the users and the application together on a single weekend. But if you discover a workload that is used by 90% of your users, that means most likely you have to find a solution for coexistence. And depending on the size of the migration project, the planning can take weeks or months. But if you don't invest this time, it can have a massive impact to your migration, because you might have to adjust your plan during the migration, which will delay your migration project, or in worst case, you need to migrate data again. Talking about coexistence solutions, you should always implement a coexistence solution for Active Directory synchronizations. Any change you make in Active Directory should be synchronized to the other tenant. If you, just an example, remove a user from a security group, and this group manages access to a critical application, you want to ensure that this change will happen in both tenants. It could be also that you just change contact information, but without having a solution for directory synchronization, you always need to update the changes in both tenants to avoid that you have different data sets or different permission in both tenants. But you will also face the challenge in finding a coexistence solution for every workload. When we talk about coexistence for shared data migration, the challenge is that there is not 100% coexistence solution available. And therefore, it's extremely important to understand which users are working together on the same content. So for example, if you have a group that uses data which is stored in the shared mailboxes or in Teams or SharePoint, you want to batch these users and this content together when you move them. And this brings me to communication. The reality is that there is data that every user wants to access. So most likely you will face the situation that some users are already working in the target tenant, but the data they want to access still resides in the source. So you need to communicate before you switch the users how they can still access this information. But you also need to communicate to your users when you will switch them and what they have to do. Don't forget that migration is more than just moving data, and you can't really automate everything. So always come up with a communication plan, share this plan so that people know when something will happen and what is needed from them to finish the migration. But also stick to your migration plan. If you agree with all stakeholders that you move, let's say 500 users every weekend, don't just change the plan and add an additional 100 users into it because you feel that there's enough time and you can move more. There could be other challenges that you might not think about, and therefore, again, try to stick to the plan and include all stakeholders first if you want to update your plan. And finally, never skip the testing. Tenant-to-tenant migrations are complex and they are never the same. And that is the exact reason why you need to test everything before you start moving your users, because it will avoid that you miss something that will hurt your migration or something that will impact your migration timeframe. But also try to pre-sync as much data as possible before starting the final event of switching users. Don't start the first data sync on a Friday evening, because Friday evening, you only want to start the last delta sync and migrate the last 5 or 10% of data. On a Friday evening, you really have to focus on so many other parts when you switch users and application, and you should not be worried that you will run out of time because the data migration is not completed. If you're interested in trying Quest on-demand migration, please sign up for the free 30-day trial. And if you found this session helpful, please also watch our other 10 minutes on Tenant Migration webcast. And thank you so much for joining me today.